Welcome to session 2 of Christianity, the Parousia, and the meaning crisis. Today we are going to get into the actual meaning crisis itself as explained by John Vervaeke. Let me just do a little bit of review of the last class. In the last class, what I tried to do, although after reading some letters from correspondents, I may not have done it so well, but I was trying to simply give us a framework for understanding in a new way or defamiliarizing concepts like Christianity, the parousia, and the meaning crisis. Not so much the meaning crisis, mostly Christianity, and especially the parousia. So as you remember, we looked at Christianity in terms of kind of a three-way, through three lenses, through the lens of Christendom and Christianity and the Christ way. And then we moved on to trying to defamiliarize the notion of the parousia, which I think probably it might even carry more baggage than the term Christianity because of the way certain notions can kind of slip in ideologically and cognitively. And then as per the meaning crisis, we're going to talk directly about that in a few seconds here when we start following John Vervaeke's lectures. So he's going to start us out by talking about how he's trying to address the meaning crisis because he noticed there was this confluence of questions that arose, especially from the fields of Buddhism and cognitive science, both of which fields he's a professor in, so it's not probably strange that he would have noticed attention being paid to areas like that. I just wanted to note that some people might not know exactly what cognitive science is. It's kind of a new branch of study that involves evidence and theorizing from the fields of philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, linguistics, and computer science. Those six fields, although there are others involved, but basically those six fields are at the intersections of what we're trying to figure out in cognitive science. Now, personally, I think a lot better word is the word I'm trying to coin as a neologism, which is just aletheity, meaning the study of truth. I'm using that neologism because I want to try to get away from the mindset that the search for truth or the search for wisdom is one that can be put into discrete departments. I mean, you certainly do need categories to make sense of things, but often in academia, you'll find that people within their own isolated departments really don't want to talk to other people at all and find it almost offensive that you would want to mix uh, different disciplines. So I think cognitive science represents a positive trend in academia in the sense that there's a active recognition among some thinking people that intersectionality and cross influence is almost unavoidable if you really want to get the heart of the matter, if you really want to discuss what reality is all about. And then for Buddhism, this is not coming so much from John as from me. I'm looking at Buddhism and all the other religions of the world. Again, I'm trying to de and refamiliarize our notions of them because I don't think they've ever been functional, actually. The category of religion has always been problematic throughout the history of, you know, intellectual history, but even more so now when we're facing the crises that we're facing. And a lot of these crises are due to the fact that we've misrepresented and misunderstood exactly where things like religion, comparative religion, philosophy, psychology, cognitive science, and all kinds of other studies belong. So I'm really attempting this radical project of throwing out the old categories, especially the categories of religion, philosophy. You see that religion actually isn't part of the cognitive science, the traditional cognitive science definition, but I would put comparative religion in there as well. I think John would probably agree with that. So anyway, what I'm seeing Buddhism and Christianity and Hinduism and Taoism and all the other isms, I'm not seeing them as systems of belief. Because belief is part of the problem, as Wittgenstein showed us at the beginning of the 20th century. The whole approach to religion or philosophy, actually, as a system of propositional logic and beliefs is highly problematic. So, what I'm calling them is I'm calling them symbologies from the Greek words symbol and ergy, like in liturgy, right? So those of you who are familiar with the Greek are going to know that this word symbology is trying to mean something like the work that symbols do. So the focus on a symbology is not going to be on the set of beliefs as much as looking practically at what the symbols within these systems do cognitively and spiritually. That's what a symbology is. Okay, so with that brief introduction, let's just look at the first couple of minutes of John's lecture, and then we'll see how some of these ideas that I'm trying to introduce dovetails here. Welcome, by the way, to Jackson. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Sorry to be late. Appreciate it being here.
Okay, so here we go. Yeah, this is it. Can you hear? Is there sound?
Welcome.
Yes.
This is
Yeah,
a
I can hear.
series in which I am going to endeavor to put together pretty much all of my work. My name is John Vervaeke. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I'm in the psychology department and in the cognitive science program, and I also teach for the Buddhism, psychology, and mental health program. I've produced a lot of videos on a lot of various topics. Some of you have perhaps seen them. But what I want to do now in this series is draw it all together and present to you an overall unified argument that can show you the interconnections between pieces that you might have seen before. Now, how all this got started is I got very interested in a particular phenomenon. I got interested in the fact that there seemed to be a growing confluence between people who are interested in Buddhism and people who are interested in cognitive science. We'll talk a little bit later as we go on what cognitive science is. But you know some of this already in the world at large because we're going through what's called the mindfulness revolution. Mindfulness is being spoken of everywhere. I was in a bookstore yesterday, chapters, and there's a whole section just on mindfulness itself.
Okay, so on the topic of mindfulness, what I really want to do is make some connections between how Orthodox Christians have traditionally thought of this. I mean, we don't really have this word mindfulness in our terminology. It actually comes originally from a Sanskrit word called sati, and sati means something more like remembering. So,
Well, we have the
Father
concept
George.
of nepsis.
Yes, well, that's where I'm going. I'm
Okay.
going exactly to the Villa. So you're jumping the gun there. But you're right, it is Nepsis, and I'm going to share the page with you where Philip Sherrard and Metropolitan Callistos, mostly Philip Sherrard, I think. Can you guys see this? It's a, what is it? What do you see on your screen?
Gray square.
Gray square. Uh-oh. Okay, let me try something else. Okay, hopefully you'll see it now. Now what do you see?
Words.
Okay, which words?
Watchfulness, the
Good.
opposite to a state of drunken
That's it.
stupor.
Okay, that's all I need to know. So here we go. Watchfulness. Nepsis in Greek. This is our Orthodox Christian understanding. This is an entry from the glossary of the Faber and Faber edition of the Philokalia, basically the only English edition of the Philokalia that we have. If you don't have a copy of this, I highly advise getting it just for the glossary alone. The investment would be worth it. We're going to be using this book, this set of books, I should say. There's 4 volumes, as well as some additional volumes, but we're going to be using this set a lot. So this is my first book recommendation for the course, because we're going to be touching base with the Neptic Fathers quite frequently. Watchfulness, of course, is the term that Father George is saying that probably is the best translation of sati, although again, sati literally means remembering, which is, I don't think that's a bad connotation of nepsis, although literally, as you see from what the editors of the Philokalia say, the opposite to a state of drunken stupor, hence spiritual sobriety, alertness, vigilance. It signifies an attitude of attentiveness. Very important word here, attentiveness, parsache in Greek, whereby one keeps watch over one's inward thoughts and fantasies, maintaining guard over the heart and intellect. Philake kathias nu, or philake nu, guarding the heart, guarding the eye of the heart, or the nous. Philake kardias, philake nu, and terias, kardias nu. Those are the Greek ideas. In Hesychios on watchfulness and holiness, that's a text from, looks like volume 1. Watchfulness, mindfulness, is given a very broad definition, being used to indicate the whole range of the practice of the virtues. Let's highlight this word here. This is going to come to play very relevantly in our discussion. So watchfulness is given a broad definition, being used to indicate the whole range of the practice of the virtues. It is closely linked to the purity of heart and stillness. The Greek title of the Philokalia is the Philokalia of the Neptic Fathers, that is, of the fathers who practiced and inculcated the virtue of watchfulness. You might even give it a subtitle as Philokalia is actually an interesting title too, because it doesn't necessarily mean the love of the good or the love of the beautiful. There's a kind of notion that the good and the beautiful are conflated, such that the word kalia, or kalos, or kalistos, or any of those different variations means something like the good beautiful, or the beautiful good. The beautiful good that is that manifests upon knowing the truth, something like that. And philo means love. So love of the beautiful good of the mindful fathers might be another way to translate the title. Okay, so that's watchfulness, or mindfulness, or remembering, or wakefulness, or awakening. You could go a lot of different ways. The reason I'm talking about it like this is because John doesn't spend a lot of time speaking about nepsis in the Orthodox Christian context, and I didn't even notice in his dialogues with Bishop Maximos of Etna that there was much discussion of it. They touched upon it a little, but I think that it's worth remembering that we have a long tradition of quote unquote mindfulness in Orthodox spirituality. Okay. Did you want to add something to that, Father George? Let's see.
You're muted.
You're muted, Father George. You're muted, Father George.
I'm muted. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm saying that was perfect, especially the last sentence. That we have correlates. Pick any spiritual system you want. You'll find correlates in our faith. And I think that's worth keeping in the back of your mind.
Nice. So about the virtues. This is a component of mindfulness or watchfulness that I think gets a little bit ignored, and it's sad because it's a key feature of this kind of spirituality. Starting just in Buddhism, basically, if you talk about the Eight Noble Truths of Buddhism, in the Eight Noble Truths, the first 6 of those Eight Noble Truths focus strictly on the cultivation of the kind of virtues that will create the spiritual conditions that will lead to the wisdom of the last 2 steps in the Eightfold Path. So you see that in Buddhism, there's a great emphasis in that Eightfold Path of those 6 virtues, those first 6 steps, cultivating the conditions for the kind of wisdom and mindfulness that's going to be practiced. Okay, the same thing is true in the Western tradition. the Western philosophical and spiritual tradition, which Orthodoxy mostly inherited, because we deal with 4 classical virtues and 3 evangelical virtues. This is not to say that the Buddhist virtues or the Brahmaviharas are to be discounted, the Brahmaviharas being love, joy, compassion, and equanimity. Those are also important virtues. But the authors of the Philokalia and some of the great Neoplatonists in history and others have seen certain virtues, namely the 4 classical virtues, to be really kind of key in the spiritual struggle. So let's take a look at those. I'm going to show you an introduction to Stoic Meditations, the Stoic Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. The introduction is by Robin Waterfield. And here's a good little mnemonic device for you to memorize the 4 classical virtues. I just thought of them today, or I just thought of this today. Cicero teaches Jesus's wisdom. So you might know that Cicero was understood to be one of the righteous of the Gentiles, I guess you could say, righteous pagan fathers. So Cicero is not a bad example to go to in terms of philosophy. Why do I say Cicero teaches Jesus's wisdom? Well, because the 4 classical virtues are, oh, let's back to that. Anybody want to guess? Does anybody already know what they are? What does the C in Cicero stand for? C stands
Compassion?
for, nope, it's a good guess. It's actually courage. Andrea. If you ever hear somebody's name being Andrew or Andrea, their name means courage. Let's see if this works. The T in teaches stands for temperance, or in Greek, we've talked about sophrosine, which is not exactly temperance. We're going to talk more about what temperance is and how to exercise it. The J in Jesus stands for justice, which is dikaisine, and with the W in wisdom is phronema, or phronesis. Not Sophia, you might note, by the way. So we're going to talk about the difference between phronesis and Sophia. But it was these 4 pillars of virtue ethics that were seen to be the sine qua non of mindfulness, of watchfulness, of nepsis, of sati, whatever you want to call it. Mindfulness and the exercise of virtues go hand in hand. And you can't have one without the other because they are reciprocally activated. That is, the more mindful you are, the more you will create the conditions to exercise the virtues. And the more you exercise the virtues, the more mindful you can become. Here's what Robin Waterfield says. The Stoics held that virtue was knowledge. Okay, already here on the get-go, we see that knowledge is not going to be understood in this way that I'm trying to think of things in the aletheity point of view. Aletheity does not see knowledge as propositional knowledge. Okay, this is how knowledge is seen in modern analytic philosophy. The understanding of what knowledge is that knowledge is something you use to justify beliefs by means of making sure that a judgment is true or false, verifying the truth or falsity of a judgment. And you can see from that definition that knowledge, according to that definition, or on that definition, is strictly limited to propositional knowledge, such that the idea is as long as you know the proposition about a truth and you verified that it's true, or maybe you falsified it, you think you have knowledge. But nothing could be farther from the case. True knowledge actually is bound up with three other kinds of knowing, of which propositional knowing is only like a narthex, if you want to speak in church terms. When you enter the church, you go into the narthex. You're not even actually really in the church yet. You're kind of where the baptismal font was, where people get initiated into the church. After you enter the church and go through the narthex, you're in the nave, where all the heavy prayer lifting is done. And then you enter the ambon and the altar into the Holy of Holies, right? So the architecture of the church is a kind of mirror of the architecture of the soul in its search and ascent toward knowledge. Propositional knowledge is just basically the things you learn as a catechumen, which are just a bunch of propositions. Most of them are found in the Nicene Creed and other creeds. These are things that you repeat and say you believe because you know you're supposed to do that, and that's fine. But never think that that's like the beginning and the end of Christian knowledge, just having memorized and recited the creed. What you then need to do is go into the nave and begin to exercise the procedural knowledge or the procedural knowing of those propositions that you uttered. That procedural knowing is mostly manifested in the Orthodox Church through the sacraments. We're going to talk a lot more about what the sacraments are and how they fit into the whole epistemic scheme of these four levels of knowing. But just know that the narthex is a place in which the sacraments are supposed to play out so as to become reflections or manifestations of the basic propositions that you're learning in the creed, in the scriptures, in the writings of the fathers, and other sources of propositional knowing. And then there's another kind of knowing which I would associate with the Amvon and the iconostasis, because the iconostasis gives us representations or perspectives on those people whose lives have been transformed by enacting the propositional and procedural knowing of the faith. And so this is at the level where you get to what's called perspectival knowing. And in perspectival knowing, this is really another way of framing reality. When you have spent enough time learning and trying to believe in the propositional knowing and doing the practices and spiritual exercises that are given to you through the sacraments of that procedural knowing in the nave, eventually you get to a point where you develop an orthodox phronema. So an orthodox way of spiritually seeing reality. A frame of mind that's orthodox, you might say, being immersed in the mind of the church. Or I would even go so far as saying the mind of Christ. The proper aim at the perspectival level of knowing is to cultivate the mind of Christ, which is a perspective on reality. I'm using mind here to mean that function of the psyche which is responsible for making judgments. Now, at a physical level, for those of us who are bound to the body or the flesh as the chief locus of our identity, those judgments often come down to what I like and what I dislike. Comes down to pleasure and pain. And so for those of us who haven't kind of illuminated the noose and restored our human perspective on the mind of Christ, what leads us around is just the avoidance of pain and the search for pleasure. Like, dislike, like, dislike, like. We're almost like liking and disliking machines, going around liking and disliking, thinking we're really making judgments when actually we're just slaves to our passions, emotions, and bodily habits. So the aim is to change the perspective so that we can enter through the royal doors, or maybe even the side doors, however you get into the altar, and change our level of participatory knowing. Okay, so all of that is done through the virtues. The Stoics recognized four primary virtues: wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice, and analyzed each of them as a kind of knowledge or knowing. Wisdom is knowing of good and bad. You have to purify or cleanse the nous to know what's really good and bad, and not just what you like and dislike, which you then interpret as good and bad. Jackson?
Is there appropriate time for you to contextualize that statement within Genesis, in the garden, in the tree?
Sure. I mean, I could sit here for hours interpreting that passage. So tell me something specifically what you're thinking about. The knowledge of good and
Well,
evil, is that
the snake says you will be like
right?
gods, having knowledge of good and evil.
Right.
Um, Yeah, I don't, I'm just stimulating ideas. I
Right.
don't have a specific question, but this made me think about
So when one is identified with the flesh, as Eve clearly was when they were tempted, right? This whole notion of the knowledge of good and evil was a notion of the duality of an evaluation of reality. So if you're grounded in your body, what's good is what you like, what gives you pleasure, and what's bad is what you don't like. If you were to see that through God's eyes, you would understand that good and evil are evaluated in totally different terms because you would not be identified with the fallen flesh. So your judgments of what are good and evil would come from, let's say, a higher noetic sphere. But what happened in the fall, the mystery of what happened in the fall is that rather than identifying with ourselves as divine beings, right? Made in the image and likeness of God as Adam was created, as it said in a few passages before that. So instead of identifying with ourselves as being reflections or mirroring the invisible reality of God, we saw or identified the substance of who we are with the fallen flesh. So an evaluation of good and evil was not based on the way God saw it, right? But on the way it was understood in the flesh. What's good and bad for me. I would actually, if I were to translate the book of Genesis into English, I wouldn't call it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I would call it the tree of the knowledge of what I like and what I dislike, or the tree of the knowledge of what I prefer and don't prefer.
And then now this is connected to why are you wearing, or who told you you were naked, right? Because now they're
Right,
naked.
right,
They are conscious of the body that they are
right,
occupying, and now their judgment is based on that. And the first
exactly,
action is the leaves on the private.
right. And that gives them shame, and this is a really important factor because three things come a result from the three major negative emotions that we experience, which are shame, fear, and anger. And they all have to do with control and what we can and can't control. So, starting with fear, fear is the emotion that we have when we think we're going to be out of control or when we're going to fail to be able to control a situation. The fear then gives rise to anger because anger is a kind of super hot energy that seeks to reach out to control what the soul was afraid it couldn't control. And then shame is an overstepping of control. It's an overstepping of bounds, which is precisely what, Eve did by taking. It's really interesting. What she did was rather than allowing the fruit to fall into her hands naturally, right? In a kind of receptive gesture, a gesture of reception. So receiving gratefully a gift, let's say from the tree of life. What she did was she reached out and took. Basically, she stole the fruit. So this reaching out and taking is an overstepping of control. It's an overstepping of the rightful place they had at that time that they had not matured into to take of the tree of knowledge of what I like and dislike. Overstepping of bonds. And that's why they were ashamed and felt naked. You're right in that, I mean, I think you're right in that that nakedness had to do with the fact that they wrongly identified with the fallen flesh as their identity, and that caused them shame because thinking that your flesh and by extension your ego, because the ego is just an extension of the physical flesh, the fallen flesh, or the sarx in Greek. If you ever hear me mention the word sarx, that's referring to flesh, versus soma, which is the Greek word for body. Okay, so you've got soma and sarx. Soma is actually blessed. It's pretty much neutral. The body is not the problem. The problem is what happens to the soma when it becomes sarx, because you want to turn your sarx or your flesh into a vessel of absolute divinity. You want to somehow make your poor soma, your poor neutral body, which is a blessed vehicle, into something that can be infinitely satisfied. And that just is not going to happen in the limited bonds of the flesh. It can't be infinitely satisfied. And we come up with all kinds of dissatisfaction, shame, and horror when we try to make the body to become a vehicle of infinite satisfaction when it becomes the flesh. Okay, so wisdom is knowledge of good and bad. Courage is knowledge of what to fear and not to fear. Note that it is knowledge, but it's not a propositional knowledge, because this is more of a know-how, right? This kind of knowing is a skill of learning what to fear and not to fear. Moderation is a skill, a procedural knowing of what to pursue and what to avoid. And justice is knowing what to give and not to give to others. Those are the 4 classical virtues. There are also 4 theological virtues having to do with hope, faith, and love, the greatest being love. I'm going to talk much later. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that now, but just to let you know that the classical virtues are all bound up with time and our immersion in the field of space-time, whereas the theological virtues allow us to transcend space-time. Very interesting how it works, about how St. Paul, in introducing the 3 theological virtues, saw a way through the theological virtues to break out of our conditioning and imprisonment in space-time. Okay, I want to show you a clip by a really great meditation teacher. Speaking of mindfulness, okay, because John Vervaeke led us on the path of mindfulness and meditation. And some people at the church and in other places have asked me, what do Orthodox do when we meditate? It's a great question. Do Orthodox meditate? Where, when, and how? Well, what is meditation? First of all, from my perspective and my experience, prayer is talking to God, and meditation is shutting up and listening. So you pray all your words, right? All the words that the church has given us to pray, and you can even add more if you want from your own heart. But at some point you have to be quiet and shut your mouth. And as John Butler says so wonderfully in his teachings, feet on the ground. This is what he always says, right? Put your feet on the ground, get grounded, and preferably when you meditate, my suggestion would be take your shoes off and put your bare feet straight on the earth, because then you're getting all, what is it? How many? Is it 432 hertz that comes from the earth?
That's funny, because that's exactly what I do.
Молодец.
I take off my shoes and socks when I meditate, for what it's worth.
You are aligning yourself with the energy of the earth, and your meditation is going to be all the more powerful. And John
Well,
Butler,
I've also listened to John Butler quite a bit.
oh yes, so you know, excellent, right? He is my favorite meditation teacher because he's pretty much an Orthodox Christian. I mean, not officially, but he prays in an Anglican church, and he's had a lot of experience in Russia. And his soul is, or I consider his soul to be an Orthodox soul. I want to show you this clip of John's for a couple of reasons. First of all, just to introduce him to you if you don't know about him, because he has other videos where he teaches meditation. So hopefully this will be a doorway that enters, that you can enter in and get to know the wonderful world of John Butler. But I really love here how he talks about the natural, because here's another thing I want to revolutionize in our thinking. Up to now, especially in, well, I guess science in the 18th and 19th century, everybody got their panties in a wad about the difference between what was natural and supernatural. And that's a false distinction. It's not really so much there's natural and supernatural. What there is there's natural and subnatural. The natural being the divine, the way things are supposed to be, that's what's natural. And what's still not yet natural, but evolving toward naturalness, is what I call the subnatural. So we live in a subnatural world that's gradually becoming more and more natural, the fullness of which naturality or naturalness will be revealed at the Parousia, when everybody is present to the reality of what is. Because what is natural. That's what's true. So I see reality, nature, and truth as being synonymous. So there is no real fallen nature. I mean, I know this is a term that the fathers and other biblical people have used, and I get it when they say there's a fallen nature. But there's really not a fallen nature because, reality can't be unreality to itself. It can only be perceived as unreality, at which point you're dealing with a kind of view of reality that is subnatural or maybe pre-natural. What I'm saying is that it's evolving toward being more natural and real. So it's not this two world scheme of a dualism in which you've got the supernatural tier up here and the natural tier down here. It's more of a continuum in which all there is nature, and those of us who perceive nature in an unrealistic and misperceiving way think that it's not natural. I would call that subnaturality. Anyway, let's listen to John first, and maybe you can have some questions afterward. He doesn't use these terms that I was talking about but he does speak on the theme of the natural. So this is kind of interesting to just juxtapose what I'm saying with what this great little talk he has to give. It's just a little 7-minute video. I think you'll like it.
Good afternoon from the same lovely place that we call Fairyland, Fairy Glen. Another question we picked up from your comments. Why is it not natural for us to be awakened? Aware, enlightened, I suppose. Ah, why indeed? Well, in a setting like this, perhaps the question doesn't make too much sense. But in the more sort of usual human situation, shut away indoors, surrounded by man-made artifacts, phones, computers, etc., under the stress and strain of life, why isn't it natural to be awake? Well, I suppose because we've substituted an unnatural existence for the natural one, and this has taken over and has stolen us away. So we're lost. But we don't think we're lost. We think we're in the real world, don't we? That our real world are problems and past and future and questions, and that's the real world, that's reality. Perhaps that's why we ask questions like this. As I've said before, it's it's a very big step to realize that what we call life is really a highway to death and is not the natural state for man. And if you want an easy way of sort of sorting life out, let me give you this. Whatever dies is not man's natural estate. Now then, what is there of life that doesn't die? Or to put it another way, what can you or can't you take beyond the grave? And when you reach old age, this is a very, very pertinent question indeed. What can you take with you beyond the grave? Most of it you have to leave behind. So is that really natural life? Or is the real natural life the promise of eternal life? And the love that doesn't change, and the everlasting peace, and the freedom that surpasses all beginnings and ends. That's the real natural life. But it probably takes most of us a whole lifetime to eliminate the unnatural, the one that's always going wrong. So deeply are we engrossed in what the Church calls sin, which is absence from God, absence from our true home. Man is a sinner. So we live in an unnatural world, but we think it's natural. And this mistaken identity is really the cause of all our trouble. Why isn't it natural to be awake? Because we're unnatural. We're unnatural. We're sort of conditioned, we're programmed, we're brought up from cradle to the grave to believe that the unnatural is natural. That the unnatural world of toil and trouble, and now coronavirus, which is, well, it is what you make of it, is natural. But the real world, the real natural world, is completely unaffected by all this, these questionable circumstances of what we call the world. The real world is spirit, which is uncorrupted, where there are no problems, no questions, and eternal life. If you like, it's paradise. We may get odd glimpses of it in this life, maybe quite prolonged glimpses of it. So be encouraged by these. But even glimpses of it come and go, don't they? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away in this world. So don't take them for the total reality. They're a glimpse of reality. We progress towards truth not so much by finding it, because who has ever found infinity? Who could ever say they found the perfect love or the ultimate freedom? We don't really find it. We move in that direction. But what we do find, we progress towards that by eliminating the limits, by eliminating the things that have a beginning and an end, by growing out of what doesn't work. In other words, unnatural, the unnatural. We grow out of it, and so we may gradually become more natural. All right. Good luck.
Okay, so with those wise words of John Butler, I'd like to talk a little bit about the things that we're growing out of as we engage in the spiritual life, which to me means the life of the virtues and a mindful life. We have this expression in the church, the world, the flesh, and the devil. I take these to be subnatural phenomena, not really real in the sense that they won't last forever. You know, adverting to St. Paul, for example, who says, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? Or to the resurrection troparion, which says, Christ has trampled down death by death. I'm not saying that death or the world, the devil or the world are not real. Clearly, they're right there in front of our faces most of the time. But because they are transitioning out of time, they don't have any substantial reality. That's what I mean when I say they're illusions. I'm not saying that they're not there and that they don't have consequences in effect. I'm saying that they're part of this sub-natural world toward which we're moving. The same can be applied to things like matter, quote unquote. Nobody's really seen matter. Space-time, duality, are all subnatural phenomena that exist only provisionally or temporarily until the fullness of time, when propaedeutic states of being and knowing have been obviated. Propaedeutic states being states of being that are only here for our learning. Death, the world of flesh and the devil exists as states of learning. Now, when I say the world, I'm really thinking a lot about, I'm thinking about death, really. I'm thinking about a book called The Denial of Death by Ernst Becker, in which this psychologist and scholar related a lot of the institutions of society to ways in which we defer facing the reality of death. So, like, in a way, society and all of its institutions are set up so that we can give ourselves over to society, mostly in the form of money, because you can't really do anything in a city without a lot of money. So money is like the key to avoiding death, because the more money you have, the more you're able to participate in urban life and in society. And the more you can do that, the more you can live the illusion that you will not die, that you'll somehow transfer your self and your being into the institutions of the world and thereby take on a kind of worldly immortality. So I see this world component as being correspondent with death, or the illusion of death. I see the flesh as being correspondent with the ego, okay? As I said before, the ego is just an extension of your physical body and your five senses. It's not really real. There's no such thing as an ego, but it certainly feels real when we're so identified with the lust of the flesh that we think that pleasure and pain are equivalent to good and evil. And then the devil I equate with evil, and I see that as only provisionally real as well, meaning that evil is a function of the ego. It's there to kind of make us question the truth and reality of God, of our ultimate concern. And its main mechanism for doing this is having us identify with the flesh, such that our identification with the flesh is so strong, there's only one antidote for it to make us come to our senses and stop identifying with our bodies as ourselves. And that mechanism is called suffering. If God had not given us suffering, we would forever live in a land of lotus eaters and bliss, in which all we were our bodies and our egos, and we would never know the truth of who we are, which transcends the flesh. Now, there are other great virtues to suffering that I could name, namely that no great progress in human development has ever been made without confronting suffering. So if necessity is the mother of invention, suffering is the mother of necessity. That's one great thing about suffering. Another thing is, what bonds us to each other as human beings better than suffering and consoling each other in our suffering? But the main virtue of suffering is, who would ever seek to cry out to God were it not for suffering and being in pain? Would not God be entirely forgotten? And there are other great virtues to suffering as well. So that's my, yes, Sarah. You're muted. You have to unmute. You have to unmute, Sarah. Sarah, you're muted.
I'd like to go back to the idea of the ego for a minute.
Okay.
I've kind of looked into that quite a bit recently, and there actually are two ideas about what the ego is, and one is kind of from the point of view of as an obstacle to spiritual development, and the other one is that the ego is actually a structure or an organ which allows us to digest our experience. And so I think, depending on where you are, that kind of ego, the functions that have been put together, is not to be vilified.
Yep.
That it is needed. That it's a thing that's needed in order to proceed, to be able to proceed and integrate and make sense of what's happening to us.
Right. Exactly right. I think you're spot on, and that's exactly why I think we need to always distinguish, and this is not something most people know that they have to distinguish. They have to distinguish between ego and egoism. Egoism is the idolatry and ideology of the ego. It's uplifting the ego as if the ego is the true self. But the ego is exactly as you said. It's a perfectly functional creation of God that was given to us at this stage in our development so that we can do a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of helpful things the ego does. Namely, the ego is our chief operating system that helps us relate to culture and to each other. If we weren't able to separate ourselves and to be able to distinguish, Sarah from Seraphim and Sarah from Father George, if we couldn't do that, that's a function of the ego. Well, I mean, how would this, I mean, it would be a mess. We'd just be a hot mess. So you're exactly right. The ego has a salubrious function. But it's when people then begin to turn around and turn it into the ideology of me, the me generation or whatever, that's when it starts to become problematic. Good point. Thank you for that. Well, I don't know if we should get into the wisdom section because we're already going on an hour, and I know our brains start to get tired after an hour. So I might leave talking about wisdom until next week. And what I'm going to do now is stop the recording and hopefully have a little bit of back and forth and dialogos. So let me stop the recording.